During the Victorian era, women were seen as ornamental, and the elaborate fashions of the day reflected this. The more ornamental and idle they were, the more it indicated how well the man of their life was providing for them. Hi, I'm Tiffany of Stitchin Addiction, and I bring historical fashion to life so that you can live out your literary dreams. Since 2020, I've been making clothes inspired by what the marches would have worn in Little Women, and today we are exploring the political influences on what the marches wore. Specifically, how the Victorian expectations of womanhood, as we discussed in our previous video, contrasted sharply with the burgeoning women's rights movement. Ayana of the Vintage Guidebook has kindly joined me again today and is here to share her expertise on fashion history with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ayana of the Vintage Guidebook. My handle is the Vintage Guidebook across all social media networks. I am a social and fashion history enthusiast. I'm currently a history student. And I love talking about the way that fashion influences society and society influences fashion. So I'm super excited to be here. And also as a big fan of Little Women. Very
Absolutely.
much.
That is the entire inspiration for this video is Little Women. We're going to talk a lot in this video about how the Alcotts and others who lived in the same time period used their clothing as a form of protest, starting with Amelia Bloomer. Everybody knows her as the woman who came up with the Bloomer costumes. Bloomers are still named after her today. And she was born in 1818, toward the end of the Regency era, right? And she was an established activist for a long time before she became such a visual part of the women's dress reform movement. For many years, she had been fighting in the temperance movement. That was actually the movement that was closest and dearest to her heart. She worked for a time in the abolitionist movement, the labor rights movement, and the free schools movement. Amelia Bloomer was an American, so this is all occurring on US soil. We talked last video about the United Kingdom influences through Queen Victoria, but we're also going to talk about some of the US influences in today's video. So Amelia Bloomer began this activist career through the Prohibition movement. This sounds completely separate from women's rights to us, right? And you would think, what do they have to do with each other? Many people even look down on the Prohibition era, kind of like, why would you take that away from people? But in Amelia's mind and time, these two were inseparably intertwined. Because women had no rights and divorce was very rarely granted, and even when divorce was granted, a woman had no legal rights to her own children and any property. Alcohol consumption was a very big problem for these women. Alcohol consumption was at its highest that it's ever been in US history to this day. And a woman had no recourse when she was married to a man who drank all of his wages, or worse yet, abused her and the children while under the influence.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that it sounds like those two things are very separate, and they are today.
Yes.
But back then, alcoholism was a huge problem. Not necessarily the amount of people, we don't have data on that, but that, yes, you could, the wages of a family working were usually paid to the man. He took that money and, in theory, was supposed to give it to his wife, his daughters, whoever, so that they could continue running the household. But what if he didn't?
Right.
A woman had no legal options at all to say, this man is wasting my money. This man could be abusing me. He could be abusing the children. He could just take it and run off, and just not be heard from for weeks, months, whatever. And because women had very few options left open to them, how are we supposed to eat while we're figuring out what he's doing? So
Exactly.
I think we need to remember this wasn't just about a bunch of, wet blanket people who just don't like drinking. This was a real problem affecting countless women across the nation. And so it did become tied together with women's rights because women were the ones being most affected by the excess in alcohol at the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And along with Bloomer advocating for this freedom for women, of course, she was advocating for them to have more rights, be able to own property, right? And be able to have rights to their children and different things like that. There was also this idea that women should have the right of freedom in dress. And at that time period, women wore between 10 to 15 pounds just of petticoats alone. Because of the style of dress we talked about in our previous video, where you had the very tight fitted bodice, and then you would wear layers upon layers of petticoats that were starched and corded underneath it to create a full skirt. And then that created the illusion that no matter how big your waist actually was, it looked smaller because your skirt was so large. And it made it very difficult to move, especially when you're going out and it's damp or it's muddy, and the bottom half of your skirts are now weighed down not only with all of the fabric weight, but now with the dampness and the mud on top of that. And to even compound the issue further, Miss Bloomer had health issues. And of course, anytime you're dressed uncomfortably and you're not feeling well, that is like the worst combination I can think of, right? And so I'm sure that this probably came into play with her advocating for women to have more freedom of dress. Men had been given freedom in their dress through the suit. And so women were now saying, we need more freedom in our dress.
I think that goes back to what we talked about before with the idleness and woman of leisure. The ideal was that a woman really shouldn't be out. I think that would be the response to a lot of this rhetoric around women saying, well, it makes it difficult for us to move. It makes it difficult for us to walk the streets and get stuff done. And I think the societal response was, well, you shouldn't be. You should be at home.
Right. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And we actually, in the next video, we're going to talk about that a little bit about how, men didn't like that, women having more freedom and being able to be out and about, and even women who had to work, they didn't like them having jobs. And I think it's interesting that this came to a head on American soil because Americans, I feel like, had less people who could live those lives of leisure because of where we were at as a society versus over in the United Kingdom, you had that very well established system of, all the lords and ladies and duchesses and the monarchy and all of those different things. But here in the US, it was more everybody was kind of having to make their own way. And except for the few people who had made it, most of them were having to go out and work.
Definitely. I think it all plays into what usually is the case, right? The people at the top dictating how everything is supposed to be for everybody else and not realizing, well, you're the 1%, the rest of us have to work
Right.
for a living.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And so Amelia Bloomer was the one who began wearing what is known as the Bloomer costume. She technically was not the first one. It was actually the cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Elizabeth Smith Miller, who first wore it in Amelia's hometown of Seneca. Apparently, Elizabeth Smith Miller had a very frustrating summer trying to garden in a dress and said, enough with that, and made some bloomers, cut her dress off, and used that to garden. And that's where Amelia Bloomer first saw the ensemble. Amelia Bloomer, however, is the one that popularized it. So you might not know this. Amelia Bloomer was married, but her husband was one of the small amount of men in that time period that allowed their wife to actually have a say and do what she wanted in many instances. And so he became postmaster of the town, and she actually worked with him. And technically, women didn't hold that job until quite a while later, but she worked with him as postmistress, and she established kind of like a area in the post office where women could just come and chat and talk. And so she had a lot of influence with the women in her town because of that, because people would just come and they would chat and they would throw these ideas around. And then she also was the publisher of the Lily, which was, I believe, the first women's rights paper. And she was the publisher for 8 years. So her husband was in, I believe, the newspaper or publishing business. I can't remember exactly which one. And so from him, she learned all about publishing. He didn't withhold that knowledge from her. He taught her, he supported her, and he supported her even in the bloomer craze and her wearing bloomers. Yeah, good man, right? Good man right there. And there was some employers who allowed their women to wear bloomers at work. We'll talk later about how the dresses of the day caused a lot of accidents for women who were working. And so this was actually good for women's safety. And throughout all of this, the National Dress Reform Association was formed as a result of Amelia Bloomer and her new outfit. So what did that outfit look like? It was a pair of like trousers, probably heavily influenced by Turkish dress. And then above that, you would wear your regular dress. You would just cut it short. Women cut it different lengths, tended to cut hers a little bit on the longer side. I believe hers was just a little bit below the knees. Some women would cut them a little bit higher, depending on, I guess, how much risk they were willing to take and what their purpose was. But this brought penalties. So because you're dressing in what was considered menswear, the bloomers were considered, like men's pants, it was considered cross-dressing. And it could bring about social ostracism as well as legal penalties. And as a result of Amelia Bloomer's costume, American cities began to expressly forbid cross-dressing so that women would not wear these things.
It's such a Victorian hallmark that they didn't like that gray area.
Yeah.
Unlike the Regency, where you sort of have women's fashion being influenced by the menswear of the period, the Victorians said, nope, we don't want any of that. And it's crazy too, because when you look at images of bloomers, I don't even know if you could, like, by our standards, call them pants. They weren't men's pants. They were these very, poofy, sort of like you said, Turkish inspired. And then they wore the dress over them even. So they're not really going that far into menswear, but the Victorians said, any little bit is too far. We got to stop this in its tracks.
Goes back to that whole idea of like structured. We have to have everything very structured.
Yeah.
We have to have everything very binary, right? And we have to adhere to these things. And so when, Amelia Bloomer is advocating for the rise of a sensible woman who dresses sensibly, right? She's questioning this entire public perception of what a woman should be. What we talked about in our last video about how women were supposed to be ornamental and they were supposed to make their man look good, right? You're supposed to be, according to Dickens, the ministering angel to domestic bliss. And this is going in direct contradiction to all of these things, right? So her dress is definitely flying in the face of all the social and gender conventions of the day. Interestingly enough, this movement failed, the dress reform movement of the 1850s, and Amelia Bloomer herself actually abandoned them for the cage crinoline because, as we'll talk about a little bit more, the cage crinoline was a great improvement over the layers of petticoats. When she was 38 years old, she decided to change back into wearing dresses. Her and her husband had recently moved to Council Bluffs, Iowa, and she was trying to make new friends and build a new circle of influence there. And so she felt like it was in the best interest of everything to just dress more conventionally. Plus, the high winds of the prairies would blow the short skirt of her bloomer outfit over her head on a regular basis. So it was just becoming not a practical thing anymore. However, I will say this fashion still influenced women's fashions in the long run. Especially when you look at sporting fashion. If you look at women's bathing suits that start in the 1850s and go all the way into the early 1900s, they look suspiciously like Amelia Bloomer's costume. You have the bloomers, and you have a short skirted dress worn over them, as well as the bloomers were used as the foundation for the bike riding ensemble, which those were all the craze in the 1890s when bikes became the thing and women started actually exercising on bikes and getting to different places by their own power, not relying on horses or men or anything else. And I wanted to say here that I am the owner of Stitchin Addiction, and you can order your own Stitchin Addiction reform dress from me and made to measure. So if you are interested in investigating that more or even in wearing one, definitely check out my website. So as we talked about, the crinoline appeared and freed women from all those heavy layers of petticoats. All right. This began in 1856. It was invented and it very, very quickly became popular. It's interesting because this crinoline took up a large amount of space, even more space than their skirts and petticoats had previously. And it seemed to express in fashion that women felt like they were more important. They could take up more space in the world, right? On the flip side, not so good side, it also served as a barrier against the lower orders. So it kind of kept them at arm's length, right? You can't get too close to me because I've got this big crinoline on now. And so it served kind of as a barrier, although the crinoline was so popular that even the lower orders adopted the fashion. It was lightweight and it allowed for a lot more circulation of air and freedom of movement. It was relatively inexpensive, so women of varying social statuses could afford it.
Yeah, if you've ever worn a big poofy prom dress, wedding dress, anything like that, you understand what layer upon layer upon layer underneath the waist will feel like. And it's very frustrating, especially if you have to go to the bathroom. Imagine something that pulls all that weight away from your legs, but still gives you the big poofy cupcake shape. Well, this was exactly what the crinoline did, so no wonder everyone wanted it. And I think it's so interesting that upper class people were looking at it. One of the effects could be, yes, we can keep poor people away. But that kind of makes me think of something interesting. Why were they so worried about poor people approaching them? Was this a problem back then? Were there somehow more poor people begging in the streets? Wonder what else was going on around that time that might make that a problem.
Exactly.
That aside, yeah, it's sort of like maybe people begging and coming up to you isn't the problem. Maybe these people should be housed and fed. I don't know. Just my take on it.
Absolutely.
But that is a big point, though, that no one who you deemed undesirable could approach you. It could also be men, right? I think anyone who has lived in a walkable city understands how annoying street harassment is. It's really a problem when you as a woman are walking from one place to another. And I think we sort of understand this idea of having a male escort, because how different is it when you're walking the streets with a male friend or something like that when you're by yourself? You probably experience way more harassment alone. Now imagine if you had on a dress where a guy literally couldn't come up to you to try to, get in your face. He can't get there. That must have seemed really appealing. Like I'm almost tempted to say, maybe we should bring it back. Have we made a mistake?
Absolutely.
A
Yes.
lot of pros for the crinoline, actually. Let's think about this.
No, it definitely, yeah, there was a lot of pros for it. It also, helped women who were didn't have the ideal waist size, let's put it that way. And so the crinoline made your skirt look even bigger. And then the drop shoulders of the era that were coming in made your shoulders and your bust area look larger. And so it created this optical illusion that you had a small waist, which that was the ideal silhouette of the era. So it enabled more women to be able to achieve that look, right? And look like they were in fashion, no matter their size. It's interesting that, this era is kind of built up of the ideal woman and what she should look like versus this fight for rights. We want women to have more rights. We want blacks to have more rights. We want children to have more rights in education. And so it's like this tight line almost that it just keeps going back and forth, right? They keep going back and forth in between. No, this is what you're going to do, but we want this, And so like all of these little steps in dress are helping them gain little tiny freedoms little by little, because as women's rights are starting to increase a little bit during the mid-Victorian era and the late Victorian era, fashion began to include more and more walking dresses. And these dresses were slightly shorter skirts, and they gave women a little bit more freedom of movement so they could actually get out and walk around. Their skirts weren't dragging and getting soaking wet or covered in mud. And so it kind of helped with all of those different things too.
And I think that's such a good point, too, about how we have these different things going on in tandem, the women's rights movement, along with this shift in clothing. Women's clothing, at least thus far in the century, 19th century, had not been so restrictive, happening alongside this movement for women not being as restricted in society. And like we said, there are different aspects of that depending on what type of woman you were, right? For
Right.
Black women, it looked a little bit differently. They were trying to access that standard, whereas white women were trying to shake off that standard. And I think it's really interesting when you start getting into the cases of like immigrant women, for
Yes.
example, like in the 1849, right, the gold rush in California, we start seeing this huge wave of Chinese immigrants who at the time, and I'm not an expert in Chinese history, so I cannot remember what dynasty it is, but the dynasty ruling in the 1840s, right, women actually wore pants. I do believe there were some dresses. Someone in the comments can correct me, but for the most part, at least women who worked following their husbands wore pants. So I wonder what that did in places where there were high populations of Chinese, California, New York, other Western territories. How were you looking at these women who wore pants? And as the Bloomer movement came around, saying, I figured it out. Women should wear pants to be more mobile. I wonder if the Chinese women were like, yeah, we know. or
Probably.
or if it maybe flipped it on its head and there was this idea of, well, those women work, so we don't really care what they wear. They're not accessing our idea of womanhood anyway. If that went in tandem with some women who are supposed to work and then the ideal woman who was not. It's really interesting to look at all those attitudes as well.
Although Amelia Bloomer and the reform dress movement in the United States failed to make lasting changes in women's fashion, depending on how you look at it, right? We cycle back again to the rational dress movement. So there was a small dress movement in the 1870s. This was called the aesthetic dress. However, this was mostly in the artist community. It didn't tend to affect women at large. So it didn't have a large effect on women's wear. It's a very beautiful dress movement. If you ever want to look it up, there's some really pretty dresses that came out of it, but it's not something that made big waves or big changes. However, the Rational Dress Society, which was based in the United Kingdom, had a wider reach. So in the 1880s, English women formed the Rational Dress Society. They were advocating for women wearing practical outfits. And this kind of came out of the rise of germ theory in 1861 by Louis Pasteur. And part of the way women and people in general changed the way they dress as a result of germ theory was that prior to that, they believed that they got sick through miasmas that were in the air. And so their best bet was to wrap themselves up tightly so that the miasmas could not get into their skin pores. But after germ theory became mainstream, they realized that wasn't true. And so they decided instead that they should wear a looser clothing that breathed and allowed the skin to breathe. And the Rational Dress Society and the Rational Dress movement built on this idea. So they were like, let women wear less undergarments. So they said that women at the time were wearing about 14 pounds of undergarments. And they were advocating for women wearing about half of that, which was 7 pounds. So they were going for boneless corsets made of airier fabrics to allow women to have not only more comfort in their dress, but also to help their health.
I appreciate that, going from 14 pounds to 7.
Absolutely. And they were still
Yeah.
trying to stay with the fashionable trends of the time. So that's why they still had healthy corsets or lighter undergarments so that you could still dress in the fashion of the time. You didn't look like a social outcast, such as Amelia Bloomer did when wearing the Bloomer ensemble. You still looked fairly normal. It was just that now you were more comfortable, more hygienic. You just didn't feel conspicuous doing it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a good point too about this move to healthier clothing, safer clothing. Let's remember, no one was advocating. Well, very few people were advocating to get rid of corsets. Those were still a thing for women across classes. Even poorer women wore corsets
Absolutely.
because they really were just the bra of their day. You needed them for bust support and for back support, especially for poor women with all the heavy manual labor they were doing. If you didn't have a corset, not only was it societally not great, like people could tell looking at you,
Yes.
the way we can tell you're not wearing a bra, we can tell. But also you needed a support garment to help you to do all of the work you were doing and or make your clothes fall the appropriate way if you were a wealthy woman. So all classes needed a corset. No one is ever saying, even the most radical, are not saying, let's get rid of corsets. They're just trying to make them more flexible, maybe more porous, more healthy. But no one's saying get rid of them. That would have been completely an alien concept to not be wearing a corset.
Right. There was very few women who were actually going without corsets. Believe it or not, though, there's evidence that Amelia Bloomer went without one when she was wearing her outfit. So,
I could see her.
yeah. And there's also some interesting stuff, and I've never gone as deep into it as I want, but the Alcotts were actually proponents of reform dress. Abigail, Louisa's mother, was into reform dress and all of those different things. And I don't really know exactly how that manifested and what that looked like for the girls and for their family, because like I said, I've never gone deep enough into it to be able to speak with authority on that. But I do know that the Alcotts they were activists in several different ways, and that was one area that Abigail got involved in was dress reform.
That's really cool. They were very like forward thinking family, I think.
They were. Louisa May Alcott was the first woman in her town to vote. It was a local election. I can't remember exactly what the office was that was being voted for, but they had allowed women to vote because at that point they were trying to win the vote by state, right? And so she went and she like made a big deal out of it and went and cast her vote and was like, I've cast my vote. I need all the other women in this town to follow my example and do this. So yeah, they were activists. They were not without their prejudice and issues, but they definitely activated for a lot of good things too throughout their lifetime. So, along with the dress reform movement that had occurred earlier in the century, the Rational Dress Society ultimately failed to move the needle on women's everyday dress. However, we've heard that before, right? However, it did make a difference in what? Sports and leisure wear. So, throughout the Victorian era, especially about the mid of the period going on into the end of the period, women began to take more and more part in sports. And I have an entire video that goes over this. So I'll pop this up in the corner for you guys to look at if you would like. And they began to do things like croquet. And by the end of the century, they were into riding bikes. And there was tennis and boating and all of these different things. And so women needed to be able to move more freely for these gymnastics. I forgot about gymnastics. Gymnastics became a thing. And so all of these movements that were being made for women's everyday dress, although they failed in the everyday dress manifestation, they did translate over most of them into the leisure activities, the sporting activities. And so women did actually get more freedom as a result. It was just they still had to, for afternoon tea or paying calls or a ball in the evening, you still had to go back to what was expected of you.
I think we see that a lot throughout history is that while doing a specific task, we can kind of loosen the rules a little bit, but just make sure, you're not wearing this anywhere else, right? There's definitely that attitude. And something else, a fun fact about that, speaking of women who moved around already, speaking of corsets and how everyone wore them, something notable is that most of the time enslaved women did not have corsets. That was not a part of their clothing allowance per se that their enslavers were supposed to give them, right? In theory, slave owners would feed and clothe their slaves appropriately. But interestingly, corsets were left out as if this was not a part of every woman's basic wardrobe. I mean, if we think of it now, think about like even women who are incarcerated get a pack of underwear, right?
Right.
These women were not even being given that. And it was actually one of the first things that any woman who then was freed or freed herself, usually the first thing they would get was a corset. And I love that for them, for reclaiming their dignity of saying,
Yes.
I am a woman. I'm going to, make sure that the world knows, like, this is real. I'm my own person now. It's kind of a sad fact, but also kind of fun. It comes
Right. That's what I was
a
going to
happy
say. It's
ending.
one more way that the slave owners strip them of their dignity, right? Is by withholding that from them. For more fun facts about historical fashion, make sure you are following Ayana at the Vintage Guidebook on all platforms. We are going to continue analyzing the political influences on Victorian fashion in a future video. We are not done yet. Remember, the Victorian era was 63 years long. So make sure you subscribe to get notifications for the next video. While you wait for that video, make sure you have watched the other videos in our Fashion is Political series.